Thank you, everyone, for joining us again on the third and final day of the Climate Leadership Conference. And congratulations again to all our award winners earlier this afternoon at our luncheon. We have another full program for you this afternoon, focusing on resilience, nature-based solutions, equity, energy, and efforts from major utilities to advance clean energy technologies. Before that, however, we'd like to recognize more of our fabulous sponsors. We'd like to thank our silver sponsors, the Government of Canada, Consumers Energy, DTE, Wholesome, Train Technologies. And also, thank you to our climate impact sponsor who are providing offsets for associated conference emissions, climate impact partners.
We'd also like to thank our government sponsor, the US EPA, who has long supported this conference, and our bronze sponsors, Jacobs, PG&E, Schneider Electric Sustainability Business, Universal Insurance Holdings, and Wells Fargo, and our exhibitor sponsor, the California Department of Water Resources.
And I know, Nat, you joined me in thanking all our sponsors that we appreciate so much, without whom we'd be able to make this wonderful convening possible, and each of whom are striving in their own voluntary commitments. So thank you again. So climate change presents many challenges, not the least of which is how we prepare for weather climate impacts. To ensure our communities can thrive, we must build resilience into all of our decisions. Our next panelists, experts across both the public and private sectors, are working to do just that. I would like to now introduce our next panel, Building Resilience in Combating the Climate Crisis, moderated by Josh Salak, and who's Managing Director of Deloitte Consulting. Josh, take it away.
Thank you. Well, good afternoon, everyone. Wow, that's loud. Okay. It's so wonderful to be here in person, really like in person, and talk about climate leadership. I'm Josh Salak. I have the honor of moderating this panel. And I have so many friends in the audience, and I hope even more online. So thank you to C2ES, the Climate Registry, Bloomberg Philanthropies for bringing us together. Since I've seen most of you last, I spent a little time helping the Biden administration through transition and getting started, and recently joined Deloitte Consulting to help lead the climate team. So we have an all-star panel for you today. Let me introduce them briefly, but I really encourage you to check out their longer bios in the app. Emily Wasley, here to my left, immediately to my left, leads corporate climate risk, adaptation, and resilience practice at WSP, and she is also the adaptation chapter lead author for the fifth National Climate Assessment. I'm going to trip over everything. And to her left, also my good friend Sarah Greenberger, who is the Associate Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Interior, where she oversees many of the issues that we're going to talk about today. To her left, Nicole LeBoeuf is the Assistant Administrator of NOAA and the Director of the National Ocean Service. And finally, Dr. Crystal Upperman is a scientist and author and an advisor to governments, companies, and NGOs. And among her honors and affiliations, she actually serves on the EPA Board of Scientific Counselors. So, wow. Thank you all for being part of this panel, and more importantly, for the amazing work that you do to protect people and our planet. So here's how this is going to work. I'm going to ask some questions of the panel, and we're going to have a discussion rather than a lecture. And so all the topics are open to all of the panelists. Chime in when you're ready. And after I ask a few questions and we talk a little bit, we're going to try to take some questions from the audience as well. So, Nicole, let me start with you. NOAA just released new sea level rise projections recently, and the National Climate Assessment, the fifth National Climate Assessment, is under development. Dropping a flag for Emily on that as well. How does climate science help us plan for resilience, and why are coastal areas important in how we adapt to climate change?
Thanks for the softball, Josh.
Come on.
The softball is the hard ball, right? Because this is, in my mind, this is really a big one. First, I just want to thank Josh and the Center for having us today. This is really a wonderful opportunity to get the word out about what is really pressing on my mind, and that is that 40% of the world's population estimate here in the United States as well lives within 60 miles or 100 kilometers of the coastline. In the United States, that's 128 million Americans that are already at risk for coastal flooding. The Interagency Sea Level Rise Report, we had a lot of really wonderful federal and academic partners on that. It provides the most up-to-date sea level rise estimates for all U.S. States and territories for which this is an issue. And we're very, very proud of the fact that it also has brought in some Alaskan and rural communities that we did not serve before with this data. So I know we may want to talk about those issues later. What I will say is that these data are so critically important. I hope everyone will take a look at this report because of the proximity of humans to the coastline as well as critical pinch points in our supply chain. I challenge anyone in the audience here to be able to say that they are either that they are not eating, wearing, or using something today that has come through our seaports. About $1.4 trillion of our goods and services, fuel, foods, medical, equipment, all come through our seaports, and that is also essentially critical infrastructure that we're paying very close attention to as the sea levels rise. And it's the back infrastructure too. These areas are flat. And that includes the roadways and the railways. And so I could go on about infrastructure, but I will, as a teaser, really ask you to read the report. There are 4 findings in the report. I'm not going to tell you what they are, but I will say that they divide down the middle for me very cleanly. 2 of them are inevitabilities. They are baked in out to the year 2100. We can do nothing but adapt. Now, nothing but adapt. We are compelled to adapt. Every day, every year that goes by that we do not adapt to coastal hazards and coastal change, we maladapt. So that's the 2 findings, so read the report. The next 2 findings are something we can do something about. And that is to say that moving forward, we can curb our emissions, you know that. But we can track and understand better the rates of sea level rise, the locations of sea level rise, and the other factors that play upon the damaging effects of sea level rise. And so I have to put in a plug for coastal and ocean observations and monitoring, absolutely. This will be very highly localized effects for communities. And so if we don't really have full-throated support and advocacy for coastal and ocean monitoring, we could lose the ballgame globally on sea level rise. And so again, number of people, proximity to critical infrastructure, and a rate of rise that is highly localized and accelerating. Take a look at the report. Again, many federal partners contributed to that. We're very proud of it. It's an update from 2017. Yeah, I'll close there for that one.
Emily, the National Climate Assessment is part of this data that we're going to be providing to folks. And every year or every cycle that we've done a new National Climate Assessment, we've tried to make it more valuable to the stakeholders. So I know that's something you guys are thinking about in this round.
Absolutely. Again, thank you for having me. I'm really honored to be on a panel of all women focused on resilience. So So a lot of the work that we do with our clients in the private sector and the public sector really does rely on the foundational science that is driven by a lot of the information that's gathered by observations, by monitoring and evaluating information and data. So the chapter that I lead is on adaptation, and we've had an adaptation chapter for the last several different national climate assessments. The National Climate Assessment comes out every 4 years. And this one, we really wanted to make sure that it was decision useful for those who really can go to the adaptation chapter and say, how do I see myself in this chapter? What information is useful? And what's really emerging through our 0 order draft, we're on the 2nd order draft now, it's going to the agencies tomorrow. But is, and we heard through public comments, is this need for transformational change. And the transformations that we're seeing in the climate and in the environment are not great. But the transformational change that we need to take as humans and in our behaviors and our technologies are pretty significant to be able to adapt to the changes that we're already seeing now and will continue to see with the baked-in emissions that we have to date. So transformational change is definitely a one component. That's hard, right? Like any change is hard, but transformational change, what does that look like? So we're finding different examples of what that looks like compared to incremental change and how different those are and how truly reformative they are in terms of, are we elevating buildings or are we actually leveraging communities and having them decide that they want to retreat inwards and inland to be safer? Differential access and equity is embedded throughout. We cannot have resilience without social equity. And that is something that is at the forefront of our entire National Climate Assessment across all the chapters, all 32. And that is, it's a no-brainer. We cannot have communities that do not have access to clean water or do not have access to clean air. And so that's another component. Science and services, are they effective? What are they? Are they being effective in terms of the decisions that people are making on adaptation? And is there a governance structure that could be put into place or that is needed to manage adaptation? And then we end with kind of a adaptation finance teaser, because there's still more to come, a lot more to come on the need to really understand what's being financed and how we track that, and then how we track the effectiveness of those investments.
I think the science piece of this, we kind of sometimes forget that, there's the need to actually do the work so that we can make better decisions. Crystal, I know, as a scientist, right, this is something that you think about all the time. Give you an opportunity to weigh in on this as well.
So Josh, you're right. I mean, I've been thinking about this since 15 years old. And for a person who's seen where we've come from and where we're at today, you're absolutely right in terms of the equity perspective. Shocks cannot be absorbed by people who are, at or below the poverty level. The World Bank has been centered around trying to eradicate poverty, and we know that climate change is going to reverse any gains that we've made in sort of preventing poverty from happening, and it's going to put more people in dire situation. To give you just a classic example, when we look at this as a holistic perspective, I grew up in inner city, and I was an avid user of a library. I loved libraries. I grew up in Mercer County, New Jersey, and I would take the bus to and from certain libraries. From an infrastructure perspective, folks generally think about just one vertical in and of itself. We think about physical infrastructure, putting a road or getting transit built to take one person from one place to the next. And oftentimes we don't realize that all of those pieces of infrastructure actually connect to other pieces of infrastructure that we now have in modern day, things like digital infrastructure, and then rolling into social infrastructure. How do people use what's in place to get from one area to the other? And these are all decisions that are made when we put piece of infrastructure in place. So getting to the equity perspective, we're using infrastructure differently. And we have to sort of figure out, how do we now look at climate change as it's going to have a shock to all of these systems, and how are each person using that system able to adapt and modify their behaviors and change, or are they not able to, and therefore they are left folly to perish? As Nicole mentioned, the majority of our population in the US live in coastal areas. Well, majority of highly burdened communities are in coastal areas. If you know about Freedmanstown, those were communities that were given to people of color after the era of emancipation and Jim Crow era that are prone to flooding. And those are the folks that are most vulnerable. So when we think about infrastructure and access, it's really important to think about who's going to be adversely impacted in present day, the folks that are locked into the knock-on impacts that you'll see, versus those later on trying to bolster systems that may be impacted into the future. So I just wanted to mention that to some of the comments that were just presented here today, Josh.
That's great. Let me transition a little bit. And Sarah, you and I started working together on the federal response to Hurricane Sandy and President Obama's Hurricane Sandy Rebuilding Task Force. And one of the things that we spent a lot of time talking about was nature-based infrastructure. And Department of Interior has a number of bureaus who are very close to this in ocean energy management, in Indian Affairs, reclamation. They have kind of unique vulnerabilities to climate change and the roles that they play. How is DOI looking at that nexus of nature-based and resilience? And that's something that, this is the first time we've ever had a pure resilience panel at CLC on the main stage. So this is kind of cool. Thank you. We're very excited about it. But we love our mitigation friends as well. And so it's mitigation and adaptation, right? It's not either or, it's both. It's green infrastructure and gray infrastructure. It's not that one is better than the other overall, they work together. So how's DOI looking at that?
Yeah, well, thank you. And again, thank you for letting me be here, especially on the first panel dedicated to resilience. That's a huge honor. And I think it's worth just giving a little bit of a perspective on what the Department of the Interior is, right? As Josh said, several bureaus, right, that have a mission to take care of our natural and cultural resources, meet our trust and treaty responsibilities to Native Americans, Alaska Natives, Native Hawaiians, and to do science. And what does that translate into? We manage over 400 million acres of federal land, over 50 million acres of tribal lands, 2.5 billion acres on the outer continental shelf. We are, through our Bureau of Reclamation, the second largest wholesale water provider, 1 out of 5 farmers in the West. We are the second largest hydropower provider, right? So we touch people's lives, right, and in the decisions that we make and their ability to be resilient in a really profound way, right? Going to water. One of my colleagues, our Commissioner of the Bureau of Reclamation, was testifying yesterday that the Colorado River is at lower levels than it has ever been before. The reservoirs are lower than anyone has ever seen them, and there is a danger that we will not be able to produce power for 6 or 7 states, right, if they are taking extraordinary measures in an unprecedented way to make sure that basic water and power remain available. When I was here in the Obama administration, I will never forget meeting with a group of people from a small village in the Arctic, and a young woman saying to me, "My home is disappearing faster than I can grow up." So, these are the Joshua Tree National Park without Joshua trees, right? Jamestown disappearing underwater. How we think about resilience, right, is at this point just has to be integrated into everything that we do across a really vast mission. Some of that will have to be hard infrastructure, right? Water recycling, roads and schools to move villages away from the coast. But it is natural infrastructure that will really allow us to produce those multiple benefits that will meet that kind of mission that we have at Interior to take care of people, our resources, including lands, water, and wildlife, and provide, benefits beyond resilience to people across the country. So we have had, I think, a number of successes. We did a lot of work after Sandy to restore wetlands that we can see now provide a resilience benefit, a recreation benefit, right? We see birds coming back, right? Wildlife benefits. But we haven't yet really integrated it in a totally systemic way into the way all of those 60,000 people who work at the Department of the Interior do their jobs every day. And that is, right, transformational change. It requires science, right? Even with a extraordinary boost of resources that we've gotten through the Infrastructure Act, which again, my colleague yesterday, talking about the Colorado River, said this is the difference from being able to just manage a crisis to plan for a future. So I can't overemphasize how important that investment is, but it's not enough to do everything. So we need to know where is the most important places to act, what are the kinds of practices that are going to be successful in those places, and making sure that they work into the future. So that's information that we have some of, but we need more. So science is key. And then people need to know how to use that science, right? It's not, as you develop alternatives and think about a decision, it's not just what you see anymore. You have to understand how to use models that are going to predict a very different future and make really challenging decisions about when is it time to move species and help them transition into a new environment, right? When is it time, right, to abandon a facility or a refuge or a park? What does that look like into the future? So we are facing these really profound decisions, and I think being able to really use natural infrastructure, understand it, integrate it, and convey the benefits is going to be one of our biggest priorities moving forward.
Josh, can I build on,
Yeah,
on Sarah's
absolutely.
point there? Because the infrastructure dollars are so important. They are only 5-year monies, but they can move the needle. You know, what I say when we talk about built infrastructure, but it's also true for nature-based infrastructure. It's a little different, but for the first time in human history, we are compelled to build things for future conditions. We have built things as a species in inclement places, in difficult to reach places, and off the. That's not what we're talking about. It's not what used to be and what is today. Every single thing we build, every single thing we restore going forward will have to be based upon what we believe the future conditions to be. That is transformational. That is a transformational shift. And we're not just crystal balling it, right? We do need the science and we need the modeling. But if you can imagine the power of nature-based infrastructure, because it moves and grooves with the changes. Now it's going to have a challenge keeping up, but we can help do that. We can select the coral species that we know are more heat tolerant, right? We can select places to allow marsh to migrate because there is uphill for it, right? And the power of these coastal ecosystems, they're great for birds, and I'm a birder, all for it. They're great for fish nurseries, but they are incredibly powerful as protection from the coastline for storms and erosion and that kind of thing. And we're only just beginning to understand how many more times powerful they are at carbon sequestration. So, I mean, if you want to look for a superpower, go to the marsh, right? That is my happy place. It has been since I was that tall. Now I know why, right? It is so much. And to Crystal's point, recovery after episodic events is hard for everybody. But if you're already underserved, if you're already systemically disadvantaged, you may not be able to come back after you evacuate. You may not be able to build back better, right? And that becomes a drain on the social fabric of those communities and the economic fabric of everyone that's proximate to that. So we really have to think about equity, not just the right thing to do for those communities, but the right thing to do for everyone. I mean, OMB has just estimated that coastal and other climate disasters are going to cost taxpayers $100 billion per year by the year 2021. That's all of us, right? So building resilience is really fundamental. Yeah, thanks. I just loved what these ladies were saying.
I think that's a really important point, and I think, you know, sometimes we forget, right? And some of us have worked for, or currently work for large infrastructure firms. So, you know, you get in this business of, we're going to build this really cool project, this bridge, this road, this power plant, this whatever. We build infrastructure for one purpose and one purpose only, which is to serve people. Mm-hmm. And we forget that sometimes, mm-hmm. and we don't tie it back to how does it serve the people. Mm-hmm. And I think that's actually an equity issue that, you know, it's not count the number of poor people who live, you know, in this area. It's about how do we actually help people do better in their lives.
Yeah. And you know, Josh, I want to tag on to that, not just about the people, but also about nature that has served us well. because we've been able to make economic gains because we've had a high-functioning environment, one that's been stable, providing us with resources, biodiversity as a whole. And I know most of you probably already know that our biodiversity is in dire risk. About half of our global GDP is at risk for being completely eroded because of because of climate change as a whole. This ties to infrastructure primarily because much of the natural landscape that we have has been upended by human infrastructure and development. So we've displaced existing landscapes that once served as habitats and pathways for much of nature out there. It's expected that, in the US, much of wildlife is going to move about 11 miles north and about 30 miles, 35 feet higher. That's going to shift and change. Right now in the Appalachia corridor, there are 2 pinch points for all of wildlife. And if we were to develop on those 2 pinch points, it would be the complete collapse of biodiversity along the Appalachia corridor. One is in Western Maryland and the other one is in Pennsylvania. So this is really critical and important. In addition to that, think about it this way. If I were to say the human body is made up about 50 to 70% water, and I say we're gonna essentially erode half of your ability to even be able to drink water, you would be panicking right now, because it's so essential and critical to your existence. Such as biodiversity, it is critical to the way we do business and the way we live life. So it's really important for us to tie infrastructure to be equitable and also support biodiversity into the future. And then also, bringing it back to the equity point, if your organization doesn't have like the classical, this is what we do, equity is what we do, I will compel you to not just look at the what, but look at the how. How are you doing your work day in, day out? Are the teams that you're pulling together reflective of the communities that you aim to serve? When you look around, is there diverse perspectives? And it can be a myriad of definitions, but are people challenging each other to really come up with salient solutions rather than going down to the status quo? You want to eliminate groupthink, because that's when we get the best solutions to be able to address this climate crisis that we're seeing today. And that's what will be necessary to sort of be able to push back and protect communities and people from these knock-on events that we'll see that are locked in. So I want to say, Josh, that it's really important to look at the equity and also the biodiversity part of it.
Great. So we got through about 2 of the 12 questions that I had in our first half hour. So let me open it up to the audience a little bit and see if you guys have some questions, and then I'm going to bring it home and give everybody a chance for a final comment in that. Do we have questions from the audience? We got some microphones. They're going to bring one to you. I'm looking, and I'm looking into a light, so it's kind of hard. Up, where? Questions? No. Okay. Here's a question. Let's wait for a microphone. They're going to bring you one. I have more questions, so I'm giving you guys an opportunity here, but I'm happy to ask more. Can you just tell us who you are and then ask your question, and we'll be happy to talk about it.
Yes, it's Ken Lightburn from the Help Offset Global Warming Foundation. I've been working on solar radiation management for 3.5 years, and I think there's a way to, I don't think we're going to make it in time with the carbon solutions because of other countries at least, even though we do a fantastic job here. I think we have to also look to, have the members considered solar radiation management as a solution? I mean, the albedo enhancement can offset the 1.12 watts per square meter surplus EEI that we're currently being hit with if you do enough of that over a large enough area such as the deserts and the ocean. Is there any room for us to consider solar radiation management? Because I think there's ways that within if we did the right research, that within 10 years we could offset the heat?
As a mitigation, as an adaptation measure, I think, one of the things that we're really trying to look at is all possible solutions. And before we get to the point of what's the answer, sometimes we have to ask what the question is. And that's where I think the work that we're doing around trying to set that baseline and understanding, what we're actually facing today, what we're going to be facing in 10 years, what we're going to be facing in 30 years, and who's going to be facing it, right? So part of that question that, I think all of you have said is, it's not just what's going to happen where, it's how is that, going to affect people. And I think that's the core of this, is really how we look at this holistically. We look at adaptation and mitigation, we look at nature-based solutions, we look at hard infrastructure, but we look at it comprehensively with that lens of how does it affect people. We've talked a lot about what government's doing. Let's talk for a second about what the corporate world is doing. We've heard from a lot of folks over the last 2 days about things that they are focused on and risk and what requirements are going to be out there. But how's the, it's one thing to say we're doing all this stuff. Where do they see where's the commercial world, where's the private sector see the opportunity? How do we bring this together? How do we make it happen?
So this gets back to the question and the comments about the nexus between adaptation and mitigation and the co-benefits that it offers in terms of solutions that both reduce your greenhouse gas emissions and help you adapt to the impacts that we're going to face and facing now. A lot of what companies are really getting their hands on now is scenario analysis, and it's been driven primarily by the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD. I'm sure everyone is familiar with TCFD, so I won't go into what it is, but it's really a great framework that both hits on the transition risks and opportunities, which are all around greenhouse gas emissions, carbon pricing, whatnot, energy efficiency, and then also the physical risks of climate change, and that's where we bring in adaptation and resilience. So it's a nice framework that now companies are much more familiar with. Cities where their companies are situated have already done vulnerability assessments. So we're seeing a lot more of discussions around partnerships between companies and cities or states where they live and work to share resources, share data, share information. And I'll just give one example of a company that we work with has a lot of data centers around the world, and data centers use a lot of water for cooling. So not only does, during COVID, an increase in the demand for data center services, for cloud services, but you have COVID, you have heat waves, you have wildfires, you have water stress. So all of these impacts are really directly impacting key assets of companies that need to be running smoothly and have redundancies in their systems, but they can't do that without people. So we're seeing a lot more focus on how resilient are our people, how resilient are our assets being people being one of many assets, but the number one asset. And we're starting to be able to have discussions about, are you working with the local water utility to understand what they're doing about resilience, and so that you can depend on them to keep that water flowing? Or can you reinvest in them and be able to support them financially or investment manners to scale up the infrastructure needed or scale up the technologies that are needed for energy and water efficiency? So there's a lot of movement, which is giving me a lot of hope around TCFD and some good energy that really I'm hoping will go in the right direction. Getting back to equity though, there isn't really much at all in the TCFD framework about social equity. And that is concerning because when companies are making decisions on how to adapt, where to adapt, for whom, with whom, by whom, you know, divesting is not the best option. It's let's lean in and enhance the resilience of the communities where they live and work and where they've extracted resources for a long time, and really, really partner with those communities to enhance the resilience, figure out what's best for that community, and support them that way. So that's one plug of if you have comments to the SEC on this new proposed ruling and want to say something about the fact that there needs to be really centralized equity across all of this work, that would be a good place to put it.
I do have my SDG pin on today, so Nicole.
Yeah, just briefly, yesterday I was speaking to the entire conference of the Reinsurance Association of America. They have an annual catastrophic modeling conference. What a fun crowd. Whew. But it was everything from geeky data types, right, to C-suite folks who really want to understand. This year's emphasis was on climate. And so a lot of what you've heard me say today, I already said to them. But I think back to your point on transformational change, right? I was completely daunted to be there. I am not one of them. I'm a marine biologist, right? And here I am trying to get them to do some stuff. But leaders in industry that are ready for transformational change and that have the space, particularly the reinsurers, right? They have the space within their operations to really move the needle. And if you just sit down with them and have the courage, I had lunch with a bunch of them, and they don't speak my language, I don't speak theirs, but there was so much like just admiration of one another for being at the table, right? To just cut through the jargon and cut through and ask, where do our interests overlap? That I think that there are really transformative changes. And actually, one of the women said, this isn't just about data or delivery of services, it's about reframing our entire way of doing decision making. And I said, yes, absolutely. It's the whole reframing of how we're going to work on this problem together. So I'm really excited about working with corporate America. And I can say from NOAA's perspective, our phones are ringing off the hook. The architecture and engineering firms, the health professionals, practitioners, states, it's really amazing who is saying, how are we going to do this? How are we going to adapt, and how are we going to get ready for climate change? We don't speak one another's language, but if you can just say, that's all right. What do you want to get out of this? What do I want to get out of this? And then the conversation begins. And then you start asking, what is resilience, right? It's not one thing. It's not something I did today and now I'm good, right? It is a desired state of being that will always be aspirational, right? Based on what you're trying to make resilient and what you're trying to make it resilient to. So begin to get to that point and talk to people you've never talked to before, because they're out there and they're ready. They're ready to work on climate change. It's exciting.
No, that's great. We haven't really talked about the resilience as a thing, but the one thing I think you really have to remember is resilience is a relative term. You have to be resilient to something. And it's a trade-off analysis, right? In the end, we're going to pick the things that we're going to accept risk for, that we're going to transfer that risk, we're going to buy down that risk. And we have to do that really purposefully to be effective at it. So we got a few minutes left. I want to end on a positive note, so I'm going to give you each an opportunity to tell us what brings you hope as you think about our long-term outlook for living in a climate-changed world. Let me start with you, Emily.
Okay, what gives me hope? Gosh, so much gives me hope. And being in this space for almost 20 years can be draining and can be really hard. But what gives me hope is the transformational change that I think we're seeing from younger generations who will not accept no. And I have a niece who's 7, I have a nephew who's 10, and they are just so excited about helping to fix the climate. And they tell my sister all the time, you need to recycle, you need to conserve your water. So it's the younger generations that are really kind of speaking up, and the voices are being heard. And the policies are out there, they're being formulated. We just need to get beyond the barriers that just keep holding us back to really be courageous and take the chance to try something differently. And I think the partnerships between corporates and the government will be so critical to really making change happen on the ground.
Great. Sarah?
You know, I think one of the questions we didn't get to, you were going to ask, is sort of how does the department, given it, our relationships with tribes, take Indigenous knowledge into account? And we don't nearly as much as we should. There's a lot to learn, but one thing we do hear all the time is we can't forget that all of these things are interconnected, that we deal with problems and issues in a very stovepipe way in the government with all of our different programs. But in fact, right, solving these problems means addressing in a very interconnected way, which I think we've heard a lot today. And I think for me, hope is the realization of the role that nature can play in solving problems in a very interconnected way, right? In terms of public health and recreation and wildlife and natural resources and resilience to extreme weather. And just, we all, I think, intuitively appreciate that so much more after being in our bedrooms or what have you, working for 2 years. So I have hope that, you know, people will see, right, investment in nature, in nature-based solutions, and natural infrastructure as a way that we can move forward with benefit to all of us. So I hope that's something that is factoring into folks' plans as they think about the future.
Nicole?
Yeah, so I want to foot stomp Emily's comment about the next generation. I would like to think that I'm sort of in between, right? The Gen Xers are sort of, there's the veterans that are still, you know, getting poised for retirement, and then there's the new folks coming up into the workforce. Being in between is not easy, right? Because the veterans, they want to take 5 years to develop a conservation plan, and then it's going to get public comment, and I'm like, oh my God, even the phrase adaptive management puts me to sleep, right? That used to be so hard, adaptive management. Whereas the folks coming into the workforce are like, go, 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 right? And so I love being in that middle ground to take the wisdom of the folks that have come before me and take, not energy, not to patronize, but a real boldness and courage to get it wrong, right? What I have noticed about the older generation and myself to some degree is we want to make sure it's right. And in the federal agencies, you really do. You don't want to put stuff on the street that hasn't been vetted and reviewed, and it's not responsible, right? But things are moving too quickly for us to take 5 years to develop a management plan. It will be outdated, right, before it even gets to public comment. And so the younger generation is pushing us to try and fail, try and fail, try and fail. Because if you fail at 5 things, that 6th one could work, and then you're off to the races, right? So it's really bold courage and commitment to tackling the climate crisis, and being in the middle of those two kind of areas is hard, but it's invigorating too, because I feel like I can benefit from both of them. And the younger generation is really open to transformational change and the use of the electronic infrastructure, which I think provides so much opportunity for equitable access to climate services and data, which is very exciting. Yeah.
Great.
I know it's not my turn, but I just want to say something very, very quickly, which is a role corporate America can play as validators, right? I think part of the reason the federal government is risk adverse is because we live in a political environment, right, which we have to depend on for our resources. To be able to complete projects and to be able, right, to survive litigation. You know, my first secretary I worked for was like, I can't get used to seeing my name in all of these lawsuits. But so there is a really important role that corporate America can play as validators to encourage risk and not punish it, right? Risk taking and not punish it.
Well, Josh, for me, the thing that really excites me is that we are finally at a place where we have political will and we have financial investment driving both policy and also action on the corporate and business side. I think, you know, if you ask folks 7 years ago, the will wasn't necessarily always there. investments was necessarily always abundant. And due to coalitions that have been pushing and driving some of these initiatives and making it really important, we're finally at a place where we can bring a lot of folks to the table to really bring forth encouraging solutions that may work. Another thing that gives me hope and leaves me encouraged is the sheer fact that environmental justice is no longer just, maligned to the side as a valid thing to take into consideration with all actions. I think it gets to the point in which we are truly looking to bring all stakeholders to the table, to bring forth solutions, to have difficult conversations. When we have difficult conversations, we can set aside differences and truly try to figure out solutions that can work. So I am really elated that we are at a point where we have the bipartisan infrastructure law that's been passed to bring forth investment in communities that have been left behind. My hope is that at some point Build Back Better gets initiated and moved forward, because that really does have much of the climate investments and environmental justice investments that we need. And I am totally encouraged that the corporate sector is taking ESG seriously, because it is good for business and it's good for the communities that you serve. So overall, I leave this panel with just sheer enthusiasm and hope that we can all continue to work together to just create a great future for the folks coming up after. The average lifespan is 73 years. When that time passes, which is when we'll see some of the knock-on effects, I won't be here. It will be the younger ones. And that is really galvanizing to feel and to recognize. So I implore us all to truly just think about not ourselves, but those we'll be leaving behind to deal with this issue.
Well, I am encouraged, because I've spent a lot of my career sitting in these seats talking about this stuff, that these brilliant ladies are here leading efforts on this, and that all of you are here today talking about this and listening to it. So thank you, my panel, thank you, my audience, and thank you, everyone, for all that you do, because we need everyone in this fight. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Josh, and the whole panel for that great conversation. And it's terrific to have resilience featured on the main stage, as you say. I think one of the things we heard pretty consistently from that panel was that the path to greater resilience and reducing emissions, those twin goals, that path has to include nature-based solutions, and that's what we'll be talking about in the next panel.